The forged will, the centerpiece of the accusation, lay on an evidence table. Noturno, with a silent command from the lady, flew to the document. The tension was palpable. The raven landed on the yellowed sheet and, with almost surgical precision, used its beak to scrape and expose a minuscule fragment of paper, almost invisible to the naked eye, embedded in the ink of the false signature. Then, Noturno raised its head and cawed, a sound that seemed to carry the very truth. Dr. Thorne, a skeptic, approached, and under the lens of a forensic magnifying glass, the fragment revealed itself to be a type of extremely rare handmade paper, used exclusively by an eccentric forger known for his obsession with details, and who had recently been seen in the company of the real culprit, a distant relative of the collector whom Eleonora had tried to protect. The signature of truth had been revealed, not by human hand, but by the sharp beak of a raven. The prosecutor's office plunged into a heavy silence, broken only by Noturno's final caw. The paper fragment, tiny and almost imperceptible, was now the center of a universe of suspicions. Dr. Thorne, a skeptic by nature, felt a chill run down his spine. That piece of handmade fiber under the magnifying glass was not just a detail, it was a silent confession, an irrefutable link to the alchemist, a renowned forger known for his almost artistic signature on illicit documents. The name Arthur Finch, the billionaire's distant great-nephew, echoed in everyone's mind. Arthur, the man with an easy smile and deep debts, who had been seen in the company of the alchemist at obscure social events, was now the prime suspect. The truth, like a hungry raven, was pecking at the surface of the lie. Arthur Finch, a man whose charm was as superficial as his fortune, had always orbited the wealth of his great-uncle, Alistair Finch, like a parasitic satellite. His failed investments and extravagant lifestyle were open secrets in social circles. He was the type of man who promised worlds and delivered sand, but no one imagined he would dare touch the essence of Alistair's life. The revelation of the paper fragment, however, painted a different picture, a darker, more desperate Arthur. The prosecutor, with a glint of determination in her eyes, ordered search and seizure warrants for Arthur's assets, knowing that the web of lies extended far beyond a simple, forged will. But the will was just one piece of the puzzle. The premise of the billionaire's mental confusion, the central piece of the manipulation, pointed to another crucial actor, the private nurse, Eleonora, the woman who, theoretically, should have been looking after Alistair's health, was now seen in a new and disturbing light. How did she fit into Arthur's plot? Was she a willing accomplice, seduced by promises of wealth, or a victim of blackmail, forced to betray her patient's trust? Eleonora's story of her apparent devotion to Alistair began to crumble under the weight of the evidence. Alistair Finch, the magnate who built an empire with his sharp mind, was now trapped in a fog. His days were a succession of moments of lucidity and memory lapses, where reality mingled with indistinct fantasies. Eleonora, with a gentle smile and steady hands, was the only constant in his disintegrating world. She administered his medications, served his meals, and helped him navigate his days. But beneath the surface of her care, a silent betrayal unfolded. The pills Alistair took religiously were no longer those his doctor had prescribed. The vials, meticulously swapped, contained substances that did not heal but confused, that did not calm but obscured the mind. Each dose was another step down the spiraling decline of his cognition, another step closer to signing documents he would never comprehend. The power of attorney, Arthur's first step to seizing control, had been signed during one of these episodes of confusion. Alistair, with a trembling hand and empty eyes, had ceded his autonomy to the one who least deserved it. Eleonora, with a pen in her hand and a lump in her throat, had witnessed the act, her conscience weighing like an anchor. She knew it was wrong, but Arthur's fear or promise held her captive. The mansion, once a beacon of intellect and power, had become a gilded cage, where its owner's mind was systematically dismantled. While the prosecution prepared to confront Arthur Finch, Notturno, the observant raven, had not finished its part. It had seen Eleonora, in her careless moments, discard the empty vials of Alistair's original medications in the mansion's garden, mixed with organic waste. It had memorized the location, the shape, the smell. Now, with the tension in the prosecutor's office almost unbearable, Notturno knew there was more to be revealed. Flying back to the mansion, it plunged among the rose bushes and shrubs, its sharp beak working with instinctive precision. One by one, it unearthed the small plastic containers, the empty packages that contained irrefutable proof of the medication substitution. With the vials carefully held in its beak, Notturno embarked on its flight back, its black silhouette cutting across the grey sky. It was not just a bird, it was a herald of truth, a link between hidden crime and the justice sought. Landing again on the evidence table, it released the empty vials, which rolled and scattered before the astonished eyes of Dr. Thorne and the prosecutor. The labels, still legible, showed the names of the medications Alistair should have been taking, but clearly was not. It was the physical proof of the manipulation, the silent evidence of Eleonora's betrayal, and the final link connecting Arthur Finch to his nefarious plot. The truth, brought by the wings of a raven, was once again undeniable. The quietness in the prosecutor's office was broken not by a sound, but by the gravity of the moment. The empty vials, small plastic cylinders that Notturno had deposited, rolled gently across the evidence table, each a silent drumbeat that resonated like a verdict. Dr. Thorne, a skeptic by nature, now watched with a mixture of awe and a pang of guilt. The labels, once mere tags, were now confessions. Names of medications that should have nourished and stabilized Alistair Finch's mind, but which unequivocally had been replaced. The prosecutor, whose hardened expression rarely wavered, felt a shiver run down her spine. The truth, brought by the wings of a raven, was once again undeniable, and this time the proof was palpable, irrefutable. Eleonora. The name echoed in everyone's mind, now tinged with a darkness that had previously seemed unthinkable. The private nurse, the trusted figure, the guardian of Alistair's health, was now the central piece of a cold and calculated betrayal. The vials were proof of her complicity, the link connecting Alistair's mental manipulation to Arthur Finch's nefarious plot. The prosecutor wasted no time. With a voice that cut the air like a blade, she ordered search and seizure warrants to be issued immediately for the Finch mansion and Eleonora's residence. The net was closing, and the time for truth was now. Meanwhile, in the opulent gilded cage of the Finch mansion, Eleonora lived her last moments of false tranquility. The gentle smile she offered Alistair was now a heavy mask, behind which fear and guilt seethed. Every step through the sumptuous corridors seemed to echo her secrets. She had justified her actions with the promise of a better life. With Arthur's subtle blackmail, who knew details of her past, she preferred to keep buried. But with each pill swapped, with each empty gaze from Alistair, a piece of her soul crumbled. She saw the effects of her betrayal in the man who, despite his wealth, was now as vulnerable as a child. The fog in which he lived was the work of her own hands, and the weight of that responsibility was overwhelming. The power of attorney, signed with a trembling hand and an obscured mind, was the ghost that haunted her. She remembered the pen in her hand, the lump in her throat, Arthur's voice whispering promises and threats. She had witnessed the act, her conscience weighing like an anchor, dragging her into the depths of a moral abyss. She knew it was wrong, but fear, the promise of a share of Alistair's fortune, or perhaps the sheer exhaustion of fighting Arthur, kept her trapped. Now, Every shadow in the mansion seemed to hide an accuser, every creak of the floorboards, a step of justice approaching. Noturno, the observant raven, had returned to its perch on Alistair's study window. Its black eyes, sharper than any forensic lens, had witnessed the entirety of the charade. It saw Eleonora, now paler, more tense, her movements once fluid, now hesitant. Eleonora felt the change in the air, a cold premonition that infiltrated every fiber of her being. She looked at the garden, at the rose bushes where she had discarded the empty vials, and a shiver ran through her body. She didn't know how, but she felt her secrets were about to be unearthed, not by human hands, but by an older, more relentless force. Arthur Finch, oblivious to the brewing storm, was in his luxurious apartment, toasting a victory he believed was his. His easy smile and unwavering self-confidence were the armor that protected him from the imminent reality. He imagined the millions that would soon be his, Alistair's empire under his control. He did not know that the tiny fragment of paper exposed by a raven's beak and the empty vials, unearthed from the garden, were the threads weaving the web of his own downfall. The truth, like a hungry raven, was not just pecking at the surface of the lie, it was dismantling it piece by piece. The prosecution, armed with irrefutable evidence, was ready to act. The Finch mansion, once a sanctuary of power and intellect, was about to become the stage for a shocking revelation. The arrival of authorities would be the climax of Eleonora's betrayal, the moment her mask would fall, exposing the fragility of her choices and the depth of her guilt. Eleonora's story, of her apparent devotion to Alistair, was about to crumble under the weight of the truth, a truth that, once again, had been brought to light by the wings of a raven. The silence of the mansion, once a refuge, now seemed filled with the expectation of a cry, the cry of imminent justice. The quietness in the prosecutor's office was broken not by a sound, but by the gravity of the moment. The empty vials, small plastic cylinders that Noturno had deposited, rolled gently across the evidence table, each a silent drumbeat that resonated like a verdict. Dr. Thorne, a skeptic by nature, now watched with a mixture of awe and a pang of guilt. The labels, once mere tags, were now confessions. Names of medications that should have nourished and stabilized Alistair Finch's mind, but which, unequivocally, had been replaced. The prosecutor, whose hardened expression rarely wavered, felt a shiver run down her spine. The truth, brought by the wings of a raven, was once again undeniable, and this time the proof was palpable, irrefutable. Eleonora. The name echoed in everyone's mind, now tinged with a darkness that had previously seemed unthinkable. The private nurse, the trusted figure, the guardian of Alistair's health, was now the central piece of a cold and calculated betrayal. The vials were proof of her complicity, the link connecting Alistair's mental manipulation to Arthur Finch's nefarious plot. The prosecutor wasted no time. With a voice that cut the air like a blade, she ordered search and seizure warrants to be issued immediately for the Finch mansion and Eleonora's residence. The net was closing, and the time for truth was now. The distant sound of sirens, almost imperceptible at first, began to pierce the quiet of the night. It was not the routine sound of the city, but a growing wail approaching the Finch estate. Eleonora, who was in the kitchen preparing a calming tea for Alistair, a cruel irony considering what she truly gave him, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She paused, the porcelain cup suspended in the air, her ears sharpened to the sound that became more distinct with each passing second. Her eyes, once focused on the task, now widened in panic. Blue and red lights began to flash through the living room windows, painting the antique furniture with a ghostly glow. It was real. The cold premonition that had haunted her for days now materialized in its most feared form. Eleonora's heart hammered wildly against her ribs, a drum of pure panic. She dropped the cup, which shattered on the marble floor with a shrill sound, echoing the collapse of her facade. Outside, police cruisers and unmarked prosecutors' cars surrounded the mansion. Agents, led by the prosecutor with an expression of steel, disembarked with warrants in hand. The massive oak door of the mansion, which for so long had guarded Alistair's secrets and, more recently, Eleonora's, was opened by one of the visibly frightened employees. The prosecutor entered, her eyes sweeping the entrance hall with unquestionable authority. Eleonora, paralyzed in the kitchen, heard the firm footsteps approaching. She tried to flee, but her legs seemed rooted to the floor. When the prosecutor and two police officers entered the kitchen, Eleonora's mask finally shattered. The gentle smile gave way to a pale face contorted by terror. Her eyes, once calculating, now pleaded, but there was no mercy in them. Eleonora Silva, you are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud and administration of controlled substances without medical authorization, the prosecutor declared, her voice cold and relentless. We have a warrant to search this property and your residence. Anything you say can and will be used against you. Eleonora said not a word. Only a choked sob escaped her lips as the police handcuffed her. The metallic glint of the handcuffs contrasted cruelly with the delicacy of her hands, the same hands that had swapped Alistair's medications. As Eleonora was escorted out, Alistair Finch, awakened by the noise, appeared at the top of the staircase. His eyes, still clouded by the fog of medication, tried to process the scene. He saw Eleonora, the woman he trusted, being led away by strangers. A deep confusion and an unspeakable sadness clouded his face. He did not comprehend the extent of the betrayal, only felt the loss of a familiar presence. Notturno, from its perch, observed everything. The arrival of the cars, the entry of the agents, Eleonora's arrest. It saw the mask fall, the truth exposed. Its black eyes, which had witnessed the beginning of the charade, now saw its climax. Justice, slow and methodical, had finally arrived at the Finch mansion. The prosecutor, ignoring Alistair's confused gaze, gave clear orders. Search for all medical records, medication vials, correspondence, and any evidence of communication between Eleonora Silva and Arthur Finch. The team spread throughout the mansion, every corner, every drawer, every closet being meticulously examined. Alistair's gilded cage was being unraveled, its secrets exposed to the cold light of the investigation. In his apartment, Arthur Finch, still toasting himself, received a call. His arrogant smile faltered when the voice on the other end of the line informed him of the mansion's raid and Eleonora's arrest. The champagne in his glass suddenly tasted bitter. The web he had so carefully woven began to unravel, and he was at its center. The victory he had imagined was turning into an overwhelming defeat. Arthur Finch, the architect of the charade, felt the ground collapse beneath his feet. The voice on the phone, once a mere messenger of good news, was now the herald of his ruin. The arrogant smile, which he had cultivated as a second skin, cracked, revealing a layer of raw panic. He threw the phone onto the glass table, the muffled sound echoing in his silent, luxurious apartment. The champagne glass, still in his hand, trembled, spilling the golden liquid onto the Persian rug. It was no longer a celebration, it was an epitaph. Eleonora arrested. The mansion raided. The words swirled in his mind like vultures, each pecking at his self-confidence. How? How had the prosecution reached her? He had planned everything with meticulous precision, covering every trace, every link, or so he thought. The raven, the image of Notturno, perched on Alistair's window, came to his mind, a dark omen he had dismissed as superstition. But now the animal seemed a sinister figure, a messenger of doom. Could it be a bird? Panic gave way to a cold fury. Eleonora, the foolish, weak, easily manipulated nurse. She must have left something behind, a clue, a mistake. He had warned her, threatened her, promised her the world. And now, she was the weakest link, the walking confession that could bring down his entire empire of lies. He needed to act, and fast. Every second that passed was a nail in his coffin. He ran to the study, his heavy footsteps echoing on the polished marble. He opened the safe, pulling out a folder of documents, contracts, bank statements, encrypted emails, proof of his transactions with Eleonora, of his plan to divert Alistair's funds, of his intention to take full control. He had kept everything, a dangerous habit of a man who believed himself invincible. With trembling hands, he began to tear the papers, throwing them into a fireplace he never used. He grabbed a lighter and started a fire, watching the flames devour the evidence of his betrayal. But with each paper that burned, with each wisp of smoke that rose, a new doubt assailed him. He had communicated with Eleonora by phone, by messages. What if there were copies? What if she had kept something? He couldn't control what she had done. Meanwhile, at the Finch mansion, the search was in full swing. The prosecutor, with her team of forensic investigators, had transformed Alistair's sanctuary into a crime scene. Every book in the vast library was examined, every painting on the walls, every piece of antique furniture. The employees, still in shock from Eleonora's arrest, watched in silence, their faces pale and their eyes filled with apprehension. In Eleonora's room, the team found a locked box under the bed. Inside, a diary. Not an ordinary diary, but a meticulous record of Alistair's medications, with notes on the substitutions and observed effects. There was also a series of printed text messages exchanged with an unknown number, but which the prosecutor suspected belonged to Arthur Finch. The messages were coded, but the context was clear. Instructions for medication swaps, promises of money, veiled threats. One of the investigators, a young and sharp-witted man, noticed something unusual in Eleonora's closet. Among her clothes, hidden in a secret pocket of an old coat, he found a small USB drive. Upon connecting it to a forensic laptop, a folder of audio files appeared. Clandestine recordings of conversations between Eleonora and Arthur Finch. Arthur's unmistakable voice, giving orders, dictating the power of attorney, and Eleonora's hesitant voice, questioning but yielding. The prosecutor listened to the audio, her expression growing darker and darker. Arthur's voice, cold and calculating, was the irrefutable proof she needed. Not just the conspiracy, but direct manipulation, coercion. Eleonora, despite her guilt, seemed to have acted under immense pressure, perhaps even blackmail, as the diary and messages suggested. Upstairs, Alistair Finch, still on the staircase, watched the chaos unfold. The fog in his mind seemed to dissipate in painful flashes. He saw strangers rummaging through his belongings, heard the murmurs, felt the tension. The image of Eleonora being led away, handcuffed, repeated in his mind. Trust, betrayal. The words, once meaningless, began to take on a terrible weight. He felt a sharp pain in his chest, not just from the confusion, but from the loss, from the violation of his sanctuary. Noturno, from its perch on the study window, watched the scene unfold with an almost solemn quietness. Its black eyes, which had witnessed the charade from the beginning, now saw justice manifest. It had brought the evidence, the paper fragments, the empty vials. And now, the truth was being unearthed, piece by human hands, but guided by its silent intervention. It saw the investigators leave Eleonora's room with boxes of evidence, the diary, the USB drive. The web was unraveled. In Arthur's apartment, the flames in the fireplace dwindled, but the fire of panic in his chest only grew. He had burned the documents, but knew it wasn't enough. The phone rang again. It was his lawyer, his voice urgent, informing him that the police were on their way to his apartment with a search and seizure warrant. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. They knew. They had proof. Eleonora had spoken, or they had found something. There was no more time to burn evidence, to plan an elaborate escape. The net was closing and he was cornered. His eyes swept across the luxurious apartment, once a symbol of his imminent victory, now a gilded cage. The arrogance that defined him crumbled, revealing a desperate man on the brink of an abyss. He ran to the bedroom, grabbed a small, pre-packed travel bag, a precautionary habit of a man who always played on the edge of the law. Money, a fake passport, a burner phone. His escape plan, once a distant fantasy, was now his only reality. But as he hurried, the distant sound of sirens, the same growing wail that had reached the Finch mansion, began to approach his own refuge. Justice, relentless and inevitable, was knocking at his door. The sirens tore through the silence of the night, a growing wail that echoed through the luxurious streets of Arthur's neighborhood. He reeked of cold sweat, the fake passport and money crumpled in his trembling hands. The security door of his apartment, once a symbol of his unshakable status, now seemed a pathetic barrier against the inevitable. He knew it was the end. There was no more time for elaborate strategies, for convincing lies. The arrogance that defined him crumbled, revealing a desperate man on the brink of an abyss, with panic corroding every fiber of his being. A violent crash at the door. "Police! Open up!" The voice, amplified by a megaphone, was unmistakable, laden with authority. Arthur froze, his heart pounding wildly against his ribs, a drum of desperation in his chest. He looked at the bag in his hands, at the burner phone. Useless. He was cornered. The web he had so carefully woven, now closing around him. Another crash, stronger, more insistent. The wood of the door began to splinter, cracking under the relentless force. Arthur let out a cry of frustration and rage, a guttural sound that echoed through the silent apartment. He threw the bag to the floor, hands on his head, the image of his perfect life, of his empire of lies, crumbling before his eyes. The door finally gave way with a crash, splinters of wood flying into the entrance hall. Armed police officers stormed the apartment, their weapons pointed at him, their faces serious and determined. The prosecutor, with the same steely expression she had worn at the Finch mansion, entered right behind, her eyes fixed on Arthur, a glint of contained triumph in her gaze. "Arthur Finch, you are under arrest on suspicion of conspiracy to commit fraud, administration of controlled substances without medical authorization, and coercion," she declared, her voice cutting like ice. "We have a warrant to search this property. Anything you say can and will be used against you." Arthur did not respond, only a look of pure hatred for the prosecutor. And then a flash of despair. The cold handcuffs on his wrists were the final touch, the seal of his defeat. He was escorted out, the luxury of his apartment mocking him with every step. The sound of the sirens, once an omen, was now the sound of his own downfall, a requiem for his boundless ambition. Back at the Finch mansion, the chaos of the investigation began to give way to a new order. Alistair, still at the top of the staircase, watched the doctors who were now examining him with concerning seriousness. The prosecutor had ensured that a specialized medical team was called immediately to assess his condition. The doctors spoke in technical terms, but Alistair understood enough to feel a chill run down his spine. Signs of prolonged sedation, interference with cognition, substances mimicking dementia symptoms. Each word was a blow, unraveling the fog that enveloped him, revealing the extent of the betrayal. Eleonora, Arthur. The betrayal was a slow poison, infiltrating his mind, stealing his lucidity, his dignity. The image of Eleonora handcuffed, being led away, returned with painful clarity. It was not just the loss of a caregiver. It was the loss of trust, the violation of his home, of his own mind. The pain in Alistair's chest intensified, but it was not physical pain. It was the pain of disappointment, of anger, of humiliation. He, a man who had built an empire, who had always been in control, had been reduced to a fish in a bowl, manipulated by those he trusted. Noturno from its perch watched Alistair. The raven seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere, the liberation that came with the truth. Its black eyes, once focused on the charade, now seemed to observe the healing, the slow reconstruction of a man. The prosecutor, after securing Arthur's arrest, returned to the mansion. She approached Alistair, her expression now softer but still laden with seriousness. "Mr. Finch, we understand this is very difficult, but justice is being served. Eleonora Silva and Arthur Finch are in custody. The evidence is overwhelming." She briefly explained what had been found: Eleonora's diary, the audio recordings, the messages. With each revelation, Alistair felt a knot in his stomach. The extent of the conspiracy was even greater than he could have imagined. His own nephew, the one he considered an heir. The prosecutor continued, "The doctors are here to help you recover. It will take time, but your mind is intact, just obscured. With proper treatment, you will return to who you were." Her words were a balm, but also a knife. Obscured. He had been stolen from himself. Anger began to simmer within him, a cold, controlled flame. He was no longer the confused, passive man. The fog was dissipating, and with it the will to fight was returning. He looked at the prosecutor, his eyes, once clouded, now displaying a glint of determination. "I want justice," Alistair said, his voice weak but firm. "I want them to pay for every day they stole from me, for every lie." The prosecutor nodded, understanding the depth of his pain and his newfound strength. "They will pay, Mr. Finch. I guarantee it." As the medical team began to administer the correct medications, Alistair felt a slight improvement, a momentary clarity. He looked at Noturno, who was still watching him. The raven tilted its head as if understanding. A silent pact, a debt of gratitude. The animal had been the herald of truth, the catalyst for justice. The mansion, once a stage of deception, was now a place of revelation and, slowly, of healing. Night fell, but for Alistair it was the dawn of a new battle, a battle to reclaim what had been stolen, and he was ready to fight. The night for Alistair was indeed a dawn. Not a dawn of sun and light, but a painful awakening of the mind, a slow tearing of the veil that had imprisoned him for so long. He woke the next morning with a strange sensation, a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. The weight in his head had lessened, the fog in his thoughts dissipated in waves, revealing memories once fragmented, now chillingly sharp. Every detail of the betrayal, every false smile from Eleonora, every calculating visit from Arthur, everything fit together like pieces of a macabre puzzle. The silence of the mansion, once an accomplice to deception, now seemed an echo of the truth. Alistair sat on the bed, feeling the weakness in his limbs, the lingering effects of the sedatives still fighting against the returning lucidity. But despite the physical debility, an inner strength, long dormant, began to bubble up. It was anger, a cold and controlled, yet intense anger that burned in his chest, anger at having been deceived, manipulated, robbed of his own mind and dignity. The doctors had left clear instructions for his recovery, and a new nursing team, carefully selected by the prosecutor, was already on standby. But Alistair felt that true healing would not come solely from medication. It would come from justice. As he had a light breakfast, served by a discreet nurse, his eyes swept over the study, the same one where Noturno had deposited the evidence. The raven was not there, but its absence was almost a presence, a constant reminder that he was not alone in his struggle. Alistair felt a deep gratitude for the animal, a silent link with nature that had exposed human rot. Later that morning, the prosecutor returned to the mansion. Her expression was serious, but there was a glint of contained satisfaction in her eyes. She sat before Alistair, who was now in his favorite armchair, his mind sharp and ready to absorb every word. "Mr. Finch, Arthur and Eleonora have been formally charged. The evidence we collected is irrefutable. Eleonora's diary, the audio recordings she made, the messages, and of course, the physical evidence your feathered friend brought us," she said with a slight smile as she mentioned Notturno. "Everything points to a well-orchestrated conspiracy to defraud you and take control of your assets." Alistair listened, each word resonating with the pain of betrayal, but also with the satisfaction of vindication. Will they pay, prosecutor? Will they pay for every day of confusion, for every lie, for every moment they stole from me? His voice was still a little hoarse, but laden with unshakable determination. "They will pay, Mr. Finch. The law will be relentless. Arthur Finch, in particular, faces serious charges of conspiracy, fraud, coercion, and administration of controlled substances. Eleonora Silva, although she acted under his influence, will also be held accountable for her active participation. The audio recordings show the pressure, but also her acquiescence." The prosecutor explained the next steps: preliminary hearings, gathering more testimonies, preparation for trial. She emphasized the importance of Alistair's testimony when he was ready. "I will be ready," Alistair affirmed, "without hesitation. I want them to see me. I want them to see that they did not destroy me. I want them to see that the truth always comes to light." The prosecutor nodded, impressed by the resilience of the man before her. "Your recovery is our priority now, Mr. Finch, but know that your voice will be crucial, and it will be heard." As the conversation continued, Alistair felt his energy slowly return. He began to ask questions about the investigation details, about the evidence, showing the shrewdness that had made him a billionaire. The prosecutor realized she was speaking not with a frail man, but with the astute Alistair Finch she knew by reputation. Suddenly, a movement at the window caught Alistair's attention. Notturno. The raven had returned, landing on its usual perch, observing them with its black, intelligent eyes. It tilted its head, as if listening to the conversation, a silent guardian of the justice it had helped unearth. Alistair felt a slight smile appear on his lips, the first genuine smile in a long time. "It seems we have an attentive listener," he commented, looking at the prosecutor. She followed his gaze and smiled too. "He seems to have a particular interest in the truth, doesn't he?" Notturno's presence was a constant reminder that even in the darkest moments, truth finds a way. The mansion, once a stage of deception and complicit silence, was now a sanctuary of recovery and a bastion of justice. Alistair knew the legal battle would be long and exhaustive, but he was no longer alone. He had the prosecutor, her team, and a raven that had been more loyal than his own family. The fog had completely dissipated, and Alistair Finch was back, ready to fight not only for his fortune, but for his honor and his life. The following morning brought not only the mental clarity Alistair so yearned for, but also a torrent of responsibilities and decisions. The fog had completely dissipated, revealing not only the extent of the betrayal, but also the complexity of the empire he had built and now needed to protect. The prosecutor, fulfilling her promise, returned with a team of legal experts, ready to delve into the financial and corporate details Arthur had tried to dismantle. Alistair, seated in his library, felt the weight of the years and the recent ordeal, but his mind was sharper than ever. He reviewed documents, charts, and bank statements, every number, every transaction, a reminder of how close he had come to losing everything. The lawyers, initially cautious with the newly recovered billionaire, soon found themselves facing a ruthless strategist. Alistair was not just the client, he was the general, mapping the legal battlefield with the same precision he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. Here, Alistair pointed to a series of fund transfers to an offshore company. Arthur used this subsidiary to divert profits. He thought I'd be too confused to notice. He was wrong. His voice, though still a little weak, carried the authority of a man who had regained control. The lawyers exchanged admiring glances. Alistair's recovery was more than physical. It was a rebirth of his intelligence and his will. The prosecutor watched, impressed. "Mr. Finch, your insight is invaluable. This significantly speeds up our financial investigation." "It's not just about the money, prosecutor," Alistair replied, his eyes fixed on the documents. "It's about the integrity of my legacy. It's about showing Arthur and Eleonora that their greed will not go unpunished. They didn't just try to steal my fortune, they tried to steal my identity, my mind. That is unforgivable." Anger simmered, but it was a cold, calculated anger that fueled his determination. He didn't want blind revenge. He wanted complete and exemplary justice. He wanted every person involved to feel the full weight of the law, not just for their crimes, but for the audacity of underestimating him. Noturno the Raven made its usual appearance, landing on the library window. Its black eyes seemed to follow the movement of Alistair's pen over the papers, as if comprehending the gravity of the situation. For Alistair, the Raven's presence was a constant reminder that truth, however hidden, always found a messenger. The animal had been the first to see the rot, the first to act. "Our friend seems to be following the progress," Alistair commented, a slight smile playing on his lips. The prosecutor nodded, a genuine smile on her face. "He has been a remarkable ally, Mr. Finch, a silent witness to the truth." And done, Alistair spent the next few hours detailing the structure of his companies, the clauses of his wills, the strategies Arthur had tried to manipulate. He revealed passwords, locations of secret documents, and even an internal audit system he had implemented years ago, precisely to protect himself from betrayals like this. The irony was bitter. He had protected himself from strangers, but was betrayed by his own family. As the legal team delved deeper into the data, Alistair asked for a moment alone with the prosecutor. "I want you to understand, prosecutor, that there will be no settlement, no bargaining. I want them to face the maximum penalty. I want Arthur to feel the weight of every decision he made, every lie he told. And Eleonora. She will have to live with the knowledge of having been a tool in her own ruin." The prosecutor looked at him, seeing the flame of a reborn man. "Mr. Finch, we will do everything in our power. The evidence is strong, and with your cooperation, the case is unassailable." Alistair nodded. "Good. Now, about the mansion's security. I want it reinforced. I don't trust anyone who hasn't been personally vetted by me or your team. And I want Eleonora and Arthur prevented from any contact with any of my employees or associates. I don't want them trying to intimidate or manipulate witnesses." "We are already taking care of that, Mr. Finch. The mansion's security has already been reinforced, and restraining orders have been issued." Alistair closed his eyes for an instant, feeling the fatigue the morning's intensity had brought him, but also a deep satisfaction. He was back. The fog had dissipated, and with it, passivity. He was Alistair Finch, the astute billionaire, the relentless strategist, and now the warrior seeking justice. Night fell again over the Finch mansion, but this time there were no shadows of deception. There was the cold, relentless light of truth, illuminating every corner, every secret. Alistair, exhausted, but with his mind at peace for the first time in months, watched Noturno fly away from the window, disappearing into the darkness. The Raven had played its part. Now it was Alistair's turn. The legal battle would be long, but he was ready for every step, every confrontation. Justice would be done, and he would ensure it. Night gave way to a dawn that promised more than just a new day. It promised the relentless advance of justice. Alistair Finch awoke with a clarity that had long been denied him, not just mental, but a clarity of purpose. The peace of the previous night after Notturno's departure had solidified into an iron determination. The legal battle would be long, he knew, but every fiber of his being was ready for it. The mansion, once a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, now buzzed with the energy of a legal team in full swing. Documents were stacked, computer screens glowed with complex spreadsheets, and the aroma of strong coffee hung in the air. Alistair, in his library, was no longer a convalescing patient, but the maestro of a legal orchestra. His mind, sharpened by the ordeal, anticipated every move, every counter-argument that Arthur and Eleonora's defense might present. "Prosecutor," Alistair began, pointing to a bank statement on his desk. Arthur wasn't just greedy, he was reckless. These transfers to Horizonte Azul Consultoria are an obvious disguise. A shell company, hastily created, with no operating history. He used this to divert funds from my personal account, trying to empty it before liquidating the company's assets. The prosecutor and her team of financial investigators nodded, impressed. They had found Horizonte Azul, but the speed with which Alistair connected the dots, revealing the intent behind the maneuver, was remarkable. He wasn't just reading the numbers, he was reading his nephew's mind. "Your intuition is an invaluable asset, Mr. Finch," said one of the lawyers, a financial crimes expert. "We are already tracing the money trail. It appears Arthur was preparing to flee, or at least to hide a substantial portion of his plunder in tax havens." Alistair closed his eyes for an instant, the image of betrayal burning in his mind. Flee. He had trusted Arthur, had groomed him to be his successor, and the man had planned to steal everything and disappear. The anger, though controlled, was a potent fuel. "I will not allow it," Alistair declared, opening his eyes with an intensity that made the lawyers recoil slightly. "I want every penny tracked, every asset frozen. I want him to have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide." As the team delved deeper into the financial records, the prosecutor received a call. Her expression hardened. "It seems Arthur's defense is attempting a maneuver. They are claiming Eleonora acted alone, under the influence of a temporary mental disorder, and that Arthur was an innocent victim, manipulated by her." Alistair let out a bitter laugh. Predictable. Arthur has always been a coward. He'll try to hide behind Eleonora's skirt, as he always has. But we have the recordings, don't we? The recordings that show his voice, his pressure, his orchestration. "Exactly," the prosecutor confirmed. "But they will try to discredit the recordings, claiming editing or coercion. And more concerning, they are trying to leak to the media the idea that you, Mr. Finch, were in such a fragile mental state that your accusations are the product of delusions." Alistair stood, walking to the window. Notturno was there, perched on its usual branch, observing the commotion in the library. The raven tilted its head, as if comprehending the new threat. "They want to paint me as a senile old man, an eccentric billionaire whose complaints shouldn't be taken seriously." Alistair reflected, his voice calm, but with an edge of steel. "It's an old tactic, but a dangerous one. We need to counterattack, not just with facts, but with the undeniable truth of my recovery." "You are right," the prosecutor agreed. "Your public appearance, your lucidity, will be the strongest proof against that narrative. But we need to be strategic. The judgment of the media can be as relentless as the court." Alistair turned from the window, his eyes fixed on the prosecutor. "Then, let's use this to our advantage. Prepare a press statement. Make it clear that I am fully recovered, that I am actively cooperating with the investigation, and that I am determined to see justice prevail. I will not allow my reputation to be tarnished by their lies." He then proceeded, detailing a communication strategy that would make any crisis manager envious. He wanted the world to know that Alistair Finch was back, and that he was not a fragile victim, but a formidable adversary. "And what about Eleonora?" Alistair asked, his voice softening slightly, but without losing its firmness. "Is she cooperating? Is there any chance she'll turn against Arthur?" The prosecutor hesitated. "She's in shock, Mr. Finch. Her lawyer is trying to negotiate a plea deal, but she's still very loyal to Arthur, or perhaps afraid of him. The recordings show she was under pressure, but also that she actively participated. She's in a difficult position. Let her reflect on her choices," Alistair said, the coldness returning to his voice. "Blind loyalty is no excuse for complicity. She will have to face the consequences of her actions, just like Arthur." The following days were a marathon of meetings, analyses, and depositions. Alistair worked tirelessly with the legal team, unraveling every knot Arthur had tried to create. He revealed the location of a second, older will that Arthur was unaware of, which contained additional protective clauses against the mismanagement of his assets. He also provided passwords for email accounts and data servers Arthur had used, allowing the team to recover incriminating communications. Noturno's presence was a constant. The Raven seemed a silent sentinel, a living reminder that truth, however much they tried to bury it, would always find a way to light. Alistair, upon seeing it, felt a deep connection with the animal, a gratitude that surpassed any human bond he had known. The prosecutor, observing Alistair in action, realized she wasn't just building a case, she was witnessing the resurrection of a giant. The fog had completely dissipated, revealing a man not only recovered, but transformed, forged in the fire of betrayal and reborn with unshakable determination. "The preliminary hearing has been scheduled," the prosecutor announced one afternoon, her voice laden with gravity. "It will be in 2 weeks. Arthur and Eleonora will be present. It will be the first direct confrontation." Alistair nodded without a shred of fear. "I will be there. I want them to see me. I want them to see the man they tried to destroy and failed. I want them to look into my eyes and see the justice that awaits them." The tension in the mansion was palpable, but it was no longer the tension of fear, but rather the tension of anticipation. The battle was about to enter its most public and decisive phase. Alistair Finch was ready. He was the general, the strategist, and the warrior, and he was not alone. Truth had a powerful ally and a winged messenger watching closely, ready to witness the final unraveling of justice. The days that followed that announcement of the preliminary hearing were not of passive waiting, but of a silent war waged on multiple fronts. Alistair Finch, the reborn strategist, would leave nothing to chance. The mansion, once a refuge for his forced convalescence, transformed into a headquarters for legal and public relations operations. Alistair's communication strategy was executed with a surgeon's precision. A carefully crafted press statement was released. It was not a victim's lament, but an affirmation of strength. In it, Alistair Finch, in his own words, declared his full recovery, his mind sharper than ever, and his unshakable determination to seek justice. He did not hide. Recent photos taken in the library showed him upright, with a penetrating gaze, alongside the prosecutor, both immersed in documents. The image was clear. Alistair Finch was in charge, and he was not a man to be underestimated. The media, always hungry for billionaire scandals, devoured the story. The narrative of a senile and delusional old man that Arthur's defense tried to plant began to crumble under the weight of visual evidence and Alistair's firm voice. Articles and social media comments shifted from "eccentric billionaire loses sanity" to headlines like "Alistair Finch fights back, justice will prevail." Public opinion, volatile as ever, began to sway. Meanwhile, Alistair's legal team gave no quarter. Every document provided, every clue unearthed, opened new avenues of investigation. The accounts of Horizonte Azul Consultoria were frozen, Arthur's tax havens exposed. The network of lies and diversions he had woven was being undone, thread by thread, revealing the complex web of his betrayal. The prosecutor, with a discreet smile, informed Alistair that international authorities were already cooperating to repatriate the diverted funds. Arthur would have nowhere to run, nowhere to hide his plunder. The pressure on Arthur and Eleonora was immense. Their lawyers, once confident, now seemed desperate. Attempts to leak distorted information to the press were quickly neutralized by Alistair's team, who had already anticipated such moves. With every blow from the defense, Alistair had a counterattack ready, irrefutable evidence, a public statement that unmasked the charade. Noturno, the raven, continued its silent vigil. Alistair watched it from the window, an unbreakable bond between them. The raven was not just a messenger, it was a symbol of truth that refused to be silenced. Its constant presence was a reminder that, even in the deepest shadows, light always found a way. Alistair, though exhausted by the long hours of work, felt a vitality he hadn't experienced in a long time. The fog of confusion had been replaced by crystal clarity and passivity by an iron determination. He was recovering not only his empire, but himself. His family's betrayal, however painful, had been the catalyst for his own resurrection. The prosecutor, on one of her visits, brought news about Eleonora. "She's at a crossroads, Mr. Finch. Her lawyer is pressing her to accept a plea deal, but she's still resisting. It seems Arthur's fear runs deeper than we imagined, or perhaps loyalty, however misguided, still binds her to him." Alistair listened, his expression impassive. "Fear is a powerful tool, prosecutor, but truth is even more so. She will have to choose. Justice will not distinguish between accomplices and orchestrators. Both will face the consequences." His voice carried no anger, but a calculating coldness, that of a man who had overcome personal pain to embrace the impartiality of the law. The days turned into a countdown to the preliminary hearing. The tension in the mansion was palpable, but it was a tension of anticipation, not apprehension. The legal team was sharp, arguments ready, evidence stacked. Alistair had reviewed every detail, every line of attack, every possible objection. He wasn't just prepared, he was armed to the teeth. The night before the hearing, Alistair was alone in the library. The silence was deep, broken only by the soft crackle of the fireplace. He picked up one of the empty packages Noturno had brought, the small box of one of the sedatives that had clouded his mind. He squeezed it in his palm, feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of the betrayal. But there was no more bitterness, only a cold resolution. He approached the window. Noturno was there as always, perched on the branch, its dark silhouette against the full moon. The raven tilted its head, its eyes glowing with an almost human intelligence. Alistair felt a wave of gratitude. Noturno had been the catalyst, the messenger of truth, the silent friend who guided him out of the fog. "Tomorrow, Noturno," Alistair whispered, his voice hoarse but firm. "Tomorrow, the truth will be heard, and justice will be done." He knew the preliminary hearing was just the beginning of a long and arduous battle, but he was ready. He was Alistair Finch, the astute billionaire, the relentless strategist, and now the warrior seeking justice. And he was not alone. Truth had a powerful ally and a winged messenger watching closely, ready to witness the final unraveling of justice. The stage was set. The first public act of Alistair's retribution was about to begin. The world was about to see that Alistair Finch was not a man to be broken, but a man who, once more, had risen from the ashes. The air that morning held a different weight. It was not the weight of oppression Alistair had known in his own home, but the weight of expectation, of imminent justice. Outside, the press's buzz was a constant hum, a discordant orchestra of flashes and microphones, all eager for a glimpse of the unfolding drama. But inside the courtroom, a cold solemnity reigned, a silence charged with power. Alistair Finch entered the courtroom with the dignity of a king in his own domain. His steps were firm, his posture erect, his sharp gaze sweeping the room. There was no trace of the confused and debilitated man Arthur and Eleonora had tried to create. In his place stood a reborn billionaire with a mind clearer and a determination more ironclad than ever. Every fiber of his being radiated unquestionable authority, a living testament to his recovery. His eyes met Arthur's first. The shock on his nephew's face was almost comical, a mixture of disbelief and terror. Arthur, who expected a frail, senile old man, saw a formidable adversary, a predator who had escaped his trap and was now preparing to counterattack. Eleonora, seated beside Arthur, looked like a wax statue, pale and wide-eyed. Her makeup couldn't hide the deep, dark circles, the weight of guilt and fear etched on her features. Alistair's gaze met hers briefly, but intensely. Eleonora shivered as if struck by an invisible electric current and averted her eyes, unable to sustain the intensity of that silent judgment. The prosecutor began the preliminary hearing with calculated calm, but with undeniable force. She presented the case with surgical clarity, detailing the premeditation, manipulation, and abuse of trust. The evidence was overwhelming. Toxicology reports, fraudulent bank statements, intercepted communications. But the most damning blow came when the empty packages those Noturno had brought were displayed. Small medicine boxes, seemingly innocent, but containing irrefutable proof of criminal intent. The prosecutor narrated the story of the Raven, the unlikely messenger of truth, and the silence in the room was almost reverent. Alistair, when called to testify, needed no notes. His voice was calm, but resonated with the authority of one who had lived the experience. He described the fog, the confusion, the feeling of losing control of his own mind and life. But more importantly, he described the clarity that returned, the struggle to rise again, and the discovery of the betrayal. He spoke of Noturno, not as a pet, but as an ally, a silent observer who, with its simple action, had unraveled the plot. His narrative was so vivid, so personal, that it transformed the coldness of facts into a story of human resilience. Arthur tried to interrupt, his voice harsh and full of forced indignation, but was quickly silenced by the judge. His lawyers seemed increasingly desperate, trying to disqualify Alistair, suggesting his recovery was convenient or that he was still confused. But with each attempt, Alistair responded with impeccable logic, with details only he could know, with a lucidity that dismantled any doubt. He cited dates, values, account names, and transactions Arthur had tried to hide, revealing the extent of his research and the depth of his memory. Eleonora, for her part, was visibly shaken. Her eyes, once fixed on the floor, now occasionally rose to Alistair, then to Arthur, as if caught between two magnetic poles. The prosecutor, noticing the fissure, directed some indirect questions that subtly pressured her. There was no direct accusation, but the suggestion that she might have acted under coercion, a door subtly opened for a possible confession. With each question, Eleonora recoiled a little more, the internal conflict stamped on her face. Arthur's fear was palpable, but Alistair's truth was an even greater weight. The judge, a man of austere countenance, listened attentively, his pen occasionally scratching paper. It was evident that the strength of Alistair's testimony and the solidity of the evidence presented were doing their work. The preliminary hearing was not to determine final guilt, but to establish whether there was sufficient evidence for a trial. And at that moment, the evidence not only existed, It screamed. At the end of the day, when the hearing was adjourned, the prosecutor exchanged a look of contained satisfaction with Alistair. It was only the first step, but a decisive one. The image of Alistair Finch, the senile billionaire, had been pulverized. In his place, the world saw a man of unbreakable strength, a strategist who had turned the tables on his betrayers. Alistair left the courtroom under a shower of flashes, but this time the glances were of admiration and respect, not pity. He did not stop for the press, but his presence had already spoken for itself. In the car, on the way to the mansion, he looked out the window. For an instant, he swore he saw Noturno perched on a courthouse gargoyle, watching the exit, a silent guardian of justice. It was a fleeting image, perhaps an illusion, but one that brought an almost imperceptible smile to Alistair's lips. The battle was far from over. Arthur and Eleonora still had their lawyers, their tactics. But the first act had concluded, and Alistair Finch had emerged victorious. The fog had completely dissipated, not only from his mind, but from public perception. He was indeed the general, the strategist, and the warrior, and the world now knew it. Truth had a powerful ally, and a winged messenger who had ensured the stage was set for the final unraveling of justice. The game had changed. The night after the preliminary hearing was long for everyone involved, but for very different reasons. At the Finch mansion, Alistair felt the accumulated fatigue, but it was a satisfying weariness, that of a job well done. He knew the groundwork was laid. The prosecutor, for her part, was in full swing. Eleonora's fragility in court had not gone unnoticed. It was the crack they needed. A formal plea bargain offer was prepared, with terms that, though severe, were infinitely milder than what Eleonora would face if tried as a full accomplice. The proposal would be delivered to her the next morning, a last chance to choose her side in the impending battle. Meanwhile, Arthur was in a frenzy of despair. The image of Alistair, so lucid and relentless, haunted his thoughts. His lawyers, once confident, now seemed small and unsure. The reality of the situation struck him like lightning. Eleonora was the weak link he knew. If she spoke, all would be lost. Paranoia corroded his mind, and he began making frantic calls, his words filled with veiled threats and empty promises, desperately trying to control the narrative, or at least control Eleonora. Eleonora, for her part, was in her own private hell. Back in her cell, the image of Alistair's gaze haunted her. It was not a look of hatred, but of disappointment and cold justice, which wounded her more deeply than any anger. Arthur's fear was a constant shadow, but the prospect of a long prison sentence, with the truth exposed to the world, was an even greater terror. She remembered what Alistair had told the prosecutor. Justice will not distinguish between accomplices and orchestrators. Those words echoed in her mind, a relentless reminder of her complicity. She was at a crossroads, and with each passing hour, the path of confession seemed less an act of betrayal and more a route of escape for her own sanity. The next morning, the prosecutor visited Eleonora, the plea offer in hand. "Miss Eleonora," she began, her voice serious, but with a tone that suggested an open door, "Mr. Finch does not seek blind revenge. He seeks justice, and justice, sometimes, allows a path to redemption. This is your chance to cooperate, to tell the truth, and to mitigate the consequences of your actions. Think carefully. Time is running out." Eleonora took the document, her hands trembling. The words blurred before her eyes, but the meaning was crystal clear. Testify against Arthur, provide the details, unravel the web of lies. It was the only way out, but the fear. Arthur's fear was still a monster. She knew what he was capable of. While Eleonora pondered her fate, Arthur, in an act of increasing desperation, attempted one last, reckless move. He instructed one of his lawyers to try to contact Eleonora, not to offer legal help, but to send a message, a veiled threat that would remind her of the consequences of betraying the family. But Alistair, anticipating such a move, had already alerted the prosecution about the possibility of Arthur trying to intimidate Eleonora. The communication was intercepted, and Arthur's attempt only served to reinforce the image of his culpability and his manipulative nature. Alistair, observing from afar, knew the pressure on Eleonora was immense. He felt no joy in her anguish, only the certainty that truth, once set in motion, was an unstoppable force. Eleonora would have to make her choice alone. And the raven, Notturno, perched on the library windowsill, seemed to share the same silent expectation. Its black eyes, deep and wise, watched the horizon as if awaiting the dawn of a new day, where truth, finally, would be fully revealed. Eleonora's fate, and with it Arthur's, now hung by a thread, and the wind of justice was about to blow. Eleonora's cell was a microcosm of the hell unfolding in her mind. The grey, cold walls seemed to close in, suffocating her. The prosecutor's proposal lay on her lap, a piece of paper that weighed more than lead, each word a sharp knife cutting her soul. Mr. Finch does not seek blind revenge. He seeks justice, and justice sometimes allows a path to redemption. The prosecutor's words echoed, mingling with Alistair's relentless voice. Justice will not distinguish between accomplices and orchestrators. She closed her eyes, trying to push away the images that haunted her. Alistair's icy gaze in court, the terror in Arthur's eyes, the uncertain future that awaited her. Arthur's fear was a familiar monster, a predator that had held her captive for so long. He whispered threats in her mind, promises of retaliation, reminding her of what happened to those who defied him. But there was another fear, a colder, more paralyzing fear, of herself, of her own cowardice, of a lifetime of regrets behind bars, with the truth distorted and her soul irredeemably stained. The night dragged on, each minute an eternity. She remembered the smell of the medications, the feeling of power in manipulating them, the adrenaline of complicity. But she also remembered the growing guilt, the nightmares, the feeling of drowning in a web of lies. Alistair had spoken of the fog that enveloped him, but Eleonora realized that she herself had lived in a fog of denial and self-deception. Now the fog was dissipating and reality was brutally clear. Dawn brought with it a new light, not of hope, but of painful clarity. She could no longer run. The choice was not between Arthur and Alistair, but between total destruction and the possibility, however remote, of a future. She raised the document, her hands still trembling, but with a new resolution. The door to redemption, however narrow, was the only way out. When the prosecutor returned, Eleonora was standing, her face pale, but her eyes fixed. "I accept." Her voice was a hoarse whisper, but firm. "I will tell everything." The prosecutor nodded, unsurprised, but with contained satisfaction. It was the moment they had been waiting for. A lawyer was provided, and the following hours turned into a whirlwind of confessions. Eleonora detailed every step of Arthur's plan, the secret instructions, the medication swap, the exact doses, the timings, the attempts to manipulate the power of attorney, the clandestine meetings with Arthur to discuss Alistair's progress. She revealed document hiding places, passwords for accounts Arthur had used, the names of minor accomplices he had involved. Her memory, once clouded by fear, now opened like a book, pouring forth a torrent of information that filled the gaps in the case. Every word Eleonora uttered was a nail in Arthur's coffin. She not only confirmed the existing evidence, but provided the context, the intent, the complete narrative the prosecution needed to seal the billionaire nephew's fate. The prosecutor listened intently, her team taking frantic notes. Eleonora's confession was not just proof, it was the master key that opened all remaining doors. As Eleonora spoke, news of her cooperation reached Arthur like a lightning bolt. His lawyers, already in a panic, tried to soften the blow, but the truth was undeniable. Eleonora had turned coat. His lawyers' meeting room, once a sanctuary of strategies and legal maneuvers, transformed into a stage for Arthur's fury. He slammed the table, knocking over papers and glasses, his eyes bloodshot. "That bitch! I knew it! I knew she didn't have the stomach for it!" His desperation was palpable, his voice hoarse with rage and betrayal. He called his contacts, his words full of empty threats, but now, without Eleonora, without control of the narrative, he was a general without an army, a king without a crown. Previous interceptions had already undermined his credibility. Now, Eleonora's confession stripped him bare. The paranoia that corroded him transformed into an overwhelming certainty. He was finished. At the Finch mansion, Alistair received the news with the same calculated serenity that had guided him throughout the process. There was no exultant triumph, only the confirmation that justice, slow and methodical, was running its course. Eleonora had made her choice, and although the consequences for her would still be severe, there was a hint of relief in knowing she had opted for the truth. He knew that greed and fear were powerful forces, capable of corrupting even the most vulnerable souls. But truth, he had learned, was the most powerful force of all. He sat in his favorite armchair in the library, an untouched book in his hands. His eyes rose to the window, where Notturno, the raven, was perched on the sill. The black bird, with its onyx eyes, seemed to share the same quietness, the same silent understanding. It had been the first to see the truth, the first to act, the unlikely messenger that had triggered the entire chain of events. Alistair smiled, a small, almost imperceptible smile. The fog had completely dissipated, not just from his mind, but from the entire scene. The truth now was a shining beacon, and there was nowhere left for Arthur to hide. The game had irreversibly changed. The stage was set for the final act, and Eleonora's confession was the prelude to Arthur's imminent downfall. Justice, finally, was about to be served in its entirety. News of Eleonora's confession hit Arthur like a lightning bolt, but what followed was a tsunami. The initial fury, an impotent roar, quickly transformed into a chilling panic. The threats, once uttered with the arrogance of one who holds power, now sounded empty, pathetic echoes in an emptying hall. His lawyers, once lions in his defense, were now rats, scrambling to disassociate themselves from the sinking ship. The phone, which once rang incessantly with offers of support and deals, now remained in sepulchral silence, or worse, received calls from his own contacts, not to offer help, but to apologize, to distance themselves, to cut ties before the contamination reached them. Arthur, in his luxurious office, felt the walls closing in. The whiskey, once a companion to celebrate victories, was now a poison that couldn't numb reality. Eleonora had unraveled the web, not just with words, but with the precision of one who had lived every moment of the plot. She had given up the names of minor accomplices, those he had thought disposable, but who now became crucial links in the chain of his condemnation. The passwords, the hiding places, the details of the illicit financial transactions, everything he had built with such care, was now a house of cards collapsing under the weight of truth. Paranoia, once a shadow, was now an overwhelming certainty. He was completely exposed, naked before justice. As Arthur drowned in his despair, the prosecution acted with relentless speed and efficiency. Eleonora's confession was the missing piece, the master key that opened all doors. Search and seizure warrants were issued in cascade, hitting not only Arthur's offices, but also the residences of his accomplices, the shell companies, the document hiding places. Every detail provided by Eleonora was verified, every clue followed, every name investigated. The prosecutor's team, once meticulous, was now an unstoppable force, driven by the clarity and irrefutability of the new evidence. The media, which until then had covered the case with the necessary caution given an influential billionaire, now exploded. Eleonora's story, the private nurse who had been coerced and later repented, leaked. Newspapers blared sensational headlines. TV stations broadcast urgent news bulletins. Arthur's image, the respectable nephew and potential heir, crumbled in real time, replaced by that of a cruel manipulator, a predator who had tried to destroy his own uncle's mind out of greed. The scandal was monumental, shaking not only financial circles, but the very fabric of high society. The Finch family, once synonymous with power and integrity, was now at the center of a storm of shame and betrayal. At the Finch mansion, Alistair watched the events unfold with an almost supernatural serenity. There was no euphoria, not a hint of vengeance in his eyes. Only the confirmation that truth, once freed, could not be contained. Eleonora, despite her complicity, had found her own path to redemption, a hard and painful but necessary path. He knew the consequences for her would be severe, but the choice to face the truth was, in itself, an act of courage. His eyes turned to the library window where Notturno, the raven, was perched. The black bird, with its silent intelligence, had been the catalyst, the unlikely messenger who had broken the silence and exposed the darkness. Alistair felt a deep gratitude for that creature, an unexpected guardian of justice. The raven, with its onyx eyes, seemed to share the same quietness, the same understanding of the closing cycle. The air in the mansion, once heavy with the fog of manipulation, now felt lighter, clearer. Truth had a weight, a gravity that reordered everything around it. The documents Arthur had tried to force, the powers of Attorney Alistair in his confused state had almost signed, were now merely proofs of a failed plot. Night fell again, but this time it did not bring with it the shadow of uncertainty. Instead, a sense of inevitability hung in the air. Media helicopters buzzed on the horizon. Police sirens could be heard in the distance, approaching Arthur's property. The net was closed. The game was over. Arthur, the architect of his own ruin, was about to reap what he had sown. Justice finally was knocking at his door, not with a whisper, but with the force of a hammer ready to tear down the empire of lies he had built. Dawn would bring not only a new day, but the end of an era of deception and the beginning of a new era of accountability. Dawn brought not only a new day, but the end of an era of deception and the beginning of a new era of accountability. The sirens, once distant, now tore through the pre-dawn silence at Arthur's property, a strident chorus announcing the inevitable. The pale light of the rising sun revealed the scene. Police cruisers and prosecutors' cars converging on the mansion, their headlights sweeping the imposing facade like spotlights on a dark stage. Inside, Arthur, in his disordered office, watched his own ruin unfold through the windows. The whiskey, which no longer numbed him, was spilled across the table, mingling with crumpled papers and torn contracts. His eyes, bloodshot and sleep-deprived, reflected a primal terror. The arrogance that defined him had shattered, revealing a pathetic, cornered man. He tried to call one last lawyer, one last contact, but the phone was silent, or the voices on the other end were cold, distant, eager to disassociate themselves. He was alone, completely. When his mansion door was forced open with a dry crash, Arthur did not move. He merely watched the police and prosecutors invade his sanctuary, their faces serious, their movements precise. The prosecutor, the same woman who had received Notturno's evidence, stood at the front, her eyes fixed on him with unshakable determination. There was no triumph in her gaze, only the cold satisfaction of justice. "Arthur Finch," her voice cut the air. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, attempted murder, and document manipulation." The words were a physical blow. Arthur staggered, but did not resist. His arms were handcuffed behind his back, the cold metal a brutal contrast to the expensive fabric of his suit. As he was escorted out, media camera flashes exploded in his face, blinding him, exposing him to the world. The one who had always controlled the narrative was now the news itself, the personification of downfall. His empire of lies crumbled under the weight of truth, and he was dragged out, a prisoner, in his own fortress. The roar of the crowd and the shouts of reporters were the soundtrack to his disgrace. Eleonora, in a safe location under the prosecution's protection, listened to the news on the radio with a complex mixture of emotions. There was no joy, only a deep weariness. The confession had been a catharsis, but also an act of self-immolation. She had chosen the truth, and now she would have to live with the consequences of her own actions. The prosecutor had been clear. Her cooperation would be taken into account, but justice demanded that she answer for her complicity. She knew the path ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in a long time, the fog in her mind had completely dissipated. She could see the future, however uncertain, with a painful but real clarity. There was a glimmer of hope, a chance for redemption, however arduous. At the Finch mansion, Alistair watched the chaos unfold on television. The image of Arthur, handcuffed and humiliated, was a spectacle he did not desire, but one that confirmed the end of a nightmare. The confusion had completely vanished from his mind, replaced by sharp lucidity and immense gratitude. He had recovered not only his fortune, but his sanity, his dignity. His eyes rose to the window. Where Noturno was perched on the sill, the raven, the unlikely messenger, the silent guardian, seemed to observe the world with the same ancient wisdom. Alistair approached, extending his hand. The bird hopped onto his arm, its onyx eyes fixed on Alistair's. There was no need for words. The understanding was mutual. Noturno had seen the darkness and acted, triggering a chain of events that restored order. It had been the catalyst, the small hero of a grand story. Alistair knew that recovery would be a process. His nephew's betrayal, his nurse's manipulation, the fragility of his own mind, all of it would leave scars. But he also knew he had survived. He had been rescued, not just by people, but by the intelligence and loyalty of an unexpected creature. The sun climbed higher in the sky, bathing the Finch mansion in a warm golden light. The air, once heavy with intrigue and fear, was now light and pure. Justice finally had been served. Arthur's empire of lies had crumbled, and truth, like a beacon, illuminated the path ahead. The Finch family, though shaken, would begin to rebuild, purified by the fire of ordeal, and Alistair, with Noturno on his shoulder, was ready to embrace a future of clarity, a future where truth, however inconvenient, would always find its way to light. The game was over. The story finally had reached its end, and justice, like the raven, had flown high, bringing with it the promise of a new dawn.